intelligencesquared.com.
Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As the chair has suggested, I'm a historian and a member of Parliament for the city of Stoke-on-Trent, and from both perspectives, I've come to think about the legacies of empire. As the greatest ceramic city in Europe, Stoke-on-Trent has long been known as the potteries, and from the kilns and pot banks of North Staffordshire, some of the finest examples of English design went out to decorate the empire. Up the Trent and Mersey Canal, the pots and plates of Wedgwood and Spode journeyed to Liverpool, across the Atlantic and around the world. The Boston tea partiers drank their tea from Wedgwood china. The cups and saucers of Staffordshire can be found even today in West Indian plantation houses, Melbourne townhouses, and Calcutta warehouses. And at the Burslem School of Art in North Stoke worked a young art teacher called Lockwood Kipling, whose designs would come to beautify that central building of the British Empire, the Victoria Terminus at Bombay, and whose son would be named after a local beauty spot, Rudyard, and he would in turn become the great poet of empire. And as a historian, I have also come to study our imperial past. And let me begin this evening by telling you that neither myself nor my colleagues need any lessons on the crimes of empire. I have stood in the city of Bridgetown at the place where the cage once stood, where runaway slaves were chained to the whipping post and whipped to a pulp for trying to escape from the barbarism of the sugar plantations. I've walked the beaches of Chennai, where 100,000 drought-driven Indian refugees gathered together in the late 1870s in the desperate hope of avoiding starvation, only to collapse and die in front of mountains of rice guarded by British soldiers. And as a biographer of Friedrich Engels, I am more than aware of the Marxist notion of primitive accumulation. As Karl Marx himself put it in Das Kapital, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation, and Marx was right that primitive accumulation, which proved so instrumental in the early history of Britain's Industrial Revolution, was intimately bound up with the story of empire. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is in the past, and our challenge this evening is to focus on the present, whether Britain's former colonies should stop blaming the empire for their ills. And our task is to challenge this notion that today's political leaders of post-colonial states can lay the blame for their current political choices on a history often only 80, 100 years old, often covering barely decades in the long history of their nations. And that is not to suggest that, as a politician of the left, on a good day, I have no appreciation of imperialism's place within a broader socio-economic context. As I've suggested and as Marx highlighted, colonialism went hand in glove with forms of mercantilism and capitalism, and at its heart was often an ethic of exploitation and inequality from which the West gained. And what was more, and as no doubt we'll hear later, we know that the divide and rule strategy of colonial elites often bifurcated nations along religious and ethnic lines, which could have devastating consequences for stability. That is accepted, as is a realization that you cannot simply blame everything on bad leaders which followed in the post-colonial period. Of course we can point to the kleptocrats, to the psychotics, to the generals, to Saddam Hussein, to Papa Doc, to Pol Pot, but our argument is much, much stronger than that. What I would like to highlight, and my colleagues will expand upon, is three issues which should make us think about seeking to offload the blame on the colonial past. And much of what this looks to is the political systems that characterize post-colonial Africa. And with it, an appreciation that to understand the political challenges facing today's Africa, you have to appreciate the pre-colonial as well as the post-colonial past. And for that, we have to get away from our Eurocentric vision, from our colonial determinism, for the very variability of the post-colonial experience of different countries with similar histories of imperial dominance point to all sorts of other factors dictating their development. So let me first look at the question of sovereignty. The first ruler of post-colonial Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, once suggested that the best way of learning to be an independent sovereign state is to be an independent sovereign state. For empire, in truth, was a fragmentary, haphazard enterprise, dominating in places, retreating in others. Claims that we'll hear tonight about its totalizing capacity belie the historical record. What is more, the episodes of colonial domination were more often than not of limited and sometimes random duration. The history of colonial nations endures far longer and far more powerfully than the often limited imperial moment. And we belittle their history and their identity when we regard their history as so much orientated around our own past. So when it comes to questions of post-colonial rule, it is often what happened before colonialism, questions of sovereignty and autonomy that matter. The preceding colonial regime is not the whole answer. And indeed, where you have moved, particularly in the case of Africa, from a settled colonial structure towards independence, as in Botswana, Zambia, and Kenya, the results have been more successful than elsewhere. And scholars today, when they talk about the neo-patrimonial state in Africa, look deep into the history of those countries rather than simply the colonial moment. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, the question of agency. Again, we belittle the history and achievements of former colonial nations if we regard empire as a determining factor in their history. When Nehru spoke of India's tryst with destiny, it was a notion of capacity and agency beyond the mind-forged imperial manacles. For outside of the great cities, the great ports, the urban edifices of empire, the colonial footprint was often subjective, sometimes even unknown. Are we to suggest that indigenous peoples of the global south can only operate in response, in reaction to the West? The history of indigenous peoples of the global south is of a far greater capacity than the imperial footprint. As Round will explain, in India, can we really say that British dominance existed for more than 100 years? And if we look to the history of India, are we really to say that the centrality of it operates around us and the British history? Finally, ladies and gentlemen, legitimacy. Blaming imperialism grants a legitimacy to an often illegitimate regime. Whether it is Gaddafi blaming Italian imperialism, Robert Mugabe blaming the British, or Teodoro Obiang of Equatorial Guinea blaming the Spanish, the bogeyman of colonialism provides a get-out card for post-colonial elites to rob their nation's wealth, butcher their opponents, and invade their neighbours. That is particularly why those of us on the left have a moral duty to support this motion. What the easy answer of empire provides is an excuse for the crimes of post-colonialism. And we are only supporting and bolstering these monsters if we allow decisions by historical actors, often hundreds of years ago, to sanction the human rights abuses and economic crimes of today. Opponents of this motion, ladies and gentlemen, are inadvertently giving succor to those denying democracy, persecuting minorities, hindering economic development, and it's not right. Of course, the past weighs heavy on former colonies of the British Empire, and we have much to learn from our shared and multiple and competing histories, but we must never let the past become an excuse for the depredations and crimes of the present, which is why I hope you'll join me this evening in supporting the motion.